It wasn't supposed to be a war where American soldiers and sailors earned honors. For 3 long, bloody years, the war to end all wars was largely a European affair. By the end of World War I, more than 9 million soldiers would lose their lives. Another 21 million would be seriously wounded. 6 million civilians would die as well, either by bombs and bullets or famine and disease. Truly, it is impossible to imagine the scale of the death and destruction of World War I. Against the 2 million military casualties suffered by Germany, almost 2 million more from the Russian Empire, and over 1 million each by both the French and the British, perhaps America's losses seem small. A little over 100,000 military deaths, about 200,000 wounded, and of course, civilians in America were protected by its oceans. But each man has only one life to live and one death to suffer. Every soldier who fought risked that life for a cause greater than his own. Some were volunteers. Most were draftees. None were prepared for this new kind of war, where thousands, or even millions, could die to gain a few yards of ground. Yet, despite their terror and against incredible adversity, a few would distinguish themselves and earn the Medal of Honor. There had been significant changes to the Medal of Honor shortly before the U.S. entered the war. Those changes were centered around the concern that medals had been awarded in cases in which the recipient's actions were not truly exceptional. The best example dates back to the earliest days of the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. At the end of June 1863, a regiment of volunteers from Maine were stationed in Washington, D.C. as General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was invading Pennsylvania. The members of the 27th Maine were nearing the end of their 9-month commitment to service and preparing to leave. Fearful that the loss of this regiment would put the capital in jeopardy, Secretary of War Stanton promised a Medal of Honor to all members of the 27th Maine who remained to fight. While this might seem an inappropriate use to modern ears, at the time, the Medal of Honor did not have the distinction it does today. There were no lesser medals to give for actions worthy of recognition, but not deserving of what is now the highest military honor in the land. 309 of the 27th Maine's 864 men remained in Washington to defend the city. But, due to clerical error, all 864 men were sent a Medal of Honor by mail. Incidents such as this led to calls for the Medal of Honor to be raised to a higher level. In 1916, Congress created a review board of retired Army officers who were to determine if any medals had been given for causes other than a member of the armed forces distinguishing himself in combat with the enemy. If there were any such cases to be found, those names were to be stricken from the official roll of Medal of Honor recipients. 911 cases were identified, including all the members of the 27th Maine and the members of President Lincoln's funeral guard. Also included were Dr. Mary Elizabeth Edwards Walker, who to this day is the only woman to be awarded a Medal of Honor, and Buffalo Bill Cody, who had been honored for his actions at Little Bighorn. Both of these medals were rescinded because neither Dr. Walker nor Buffalo Bill were members of the armed forces, but were civilians who were serving alongside soldiers. Walker and Cody would be reinstated to the roll of Medal of Honor recipients decades later, as would a handful of others. But they were the exception, while the others served as a sacrifice to sanctity and distinction of the Medal of Honor. To further raise the bar for that highest award, in 1918, Congress created the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star in response to a recommendation from General Pershing. He pointed out the need to recognize actions that were valorous, but not above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor could now be reserved for the most extraordinary examples of valor. Henceforth, the Medal of Honor would only be bestowed upon individuals in the Army, Navy, or Marines who distinguished themselves conspicuously by gallantry and by intrepid actions at the risk of their lives above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in armed conflict. Despite the tightening of the rules, 119 men would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their valorous actions during World War I. That war had been grinding on for 3 years by the time America got involved. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the entangling alliances of European nations were set on a course for war on a scale never before seen by man. War was first declared between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Soon, Russia, Germany, France, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, Italy, Bulgaria, Japan, Romania, Belgium, Portugal, and more were siding with one set of allies or another and sending their young men to die in the trenches of the First World War. America sought to remain neutral in the early years of the war. American weapons manufacturers were free to sell arms to either side in the war, though in practice, the British blockade of Germany meant that American goods reached only Britain and her allies. President Woodrow Wilson strove to maintain America's neutrality and sought to broker a peace deal between Germany and Britain. Wilson was reelected in large measure because he had kept America out of the war. But Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare pushed Wilson and the nation too far.
The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. American ships have been sunk, American lives taken.
Further outraging Americans was the revelation of a telegram from Germany's foreign secretary to his ambassador in Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram, as it is known, invited Mexico to join the war as a German ally. In return, Germany promised to aid Mexico in recovering territory it had lost in the United States 70 years earlier: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. After the Zimmermann telegram and Germany's sinking of 7 U.S. merchant ships, Wilson asked the Congress for a formal declaration of war.
The challenge is to all mankind. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind.
U.S. Congress declared the nation at war with Germany on April 6, 1917. The Germans were not exactly frightened by this turn of events. As one German admiral said,
America from a military point of view means nothing. And again, nothing. And for third time, nothing.
At that time, the American Army had just over 127,000 men, with another 80,000 in the National Guard and fewer than 14,000 Marines. For perspective, consider that the British had almost 420,000 casualties in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And in stark contrast to what President Dwight Eisenhower would decades later call the military-industrial complex, America's industrial might had not turned to producing the tanks and machine guns en masse that would be necessary for the warfare to come. Germany wasn't alone in doubting America's military might. Neither Britain nor France believed that the U.S. could raise, train, equip, and field a sizable force in the time required. And time was not on the side of the Allies. At this point in the war, the Allied forces were collapsing. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated, and the provisional government was ineffectual. The war was already deeply unpopular in Russia, and their army was falling apart. Within a year, the Bolsheviks would take control and make a separate peace with the Germans. Suddenly, a vast German-Austrian force that had been tied to the Eastern Front could be turned against the British and French. The German U-boats, now granted unrestricted use by German commanders, were sinking 500,000 tons of British goods a month on a path to starving the nation. French military divisions were in open mutiny, with tens of thousands deserting. They were revolting against being fed into the meat grinder that the war had become. But although America had a small standing army, the overall population was over 90 million strong, larger than Britain and France combined. And in May 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, and the Army grew quickly. America would send 2 million men to fight overseas, but it would take time to get those men ready. Although the first American troops would arrive in Europe in July 1917, it would be almost a year, May 1918, before U.S. forces would see combat. But in those final months of the war, American soldiers saw firsthand the carnage that European fighters had been living with for years. One group of those American troops was the 93rd Infantry Division, composed of 4 all-black infantry regiments. All 4 regiments were loaned to the French, who were in desperate need for troops to replace their losses. This was considered a temporary arrangement, but it lasted through the end of the conflict. The men of the 371st Regiment were draftees from South Carolina. They arrived on the Western Front in April 1918 and began training with the French. In the summer of that year, they served as part of the French Fourth Army and participated in the occupation of the Verdun sector. In September, the 371st moved with the rest of the French Fourth Army to take its role in the Allies' final major offensive. Beginning in late summer 1918, the Allies had launched a series of assaults along the Western Front, now known as the Grand Offensive. Initial victories had pushed back the German defense. At this stage of the offensive, at the end of September 1918, the Allies sought to smash through the Hindenburg Line, a vast network of German defenses in northeastern France. The Hindenburg Line included trenches, concrete bunkers, and machine gun emplacements, heavy belts of barbed wire, and tunnels for troop movement. The German High Command believed it could not be broken. The 371st Regiment, serving with the French Fourth Army, would join the assault on the Hindenburg Line along the Meuse-Argonne front. They were acting in support of the American First Army, with command coordinated between the French and the U.S. forces. The Argonne offensive would be successful, but would come at a high cost. The 371st would suffer over 1,000 casualties, more than 40% of the regiment. The regiment proved American soldiers, regardless of race, would stand firm under fire and fight to win. By its actions in this offensive, the 371st earned honors from both the French and American forces. The regiment as a whole was awarded the French Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. 10 individual officers and a dozen enlisted men were also decorated with the American Distinguished Service Cross. And one corporal would show such valor that he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Freddy Stowers was the grandson of a slave. He grew up in South Carolina, and when he was drafted into the Army in 1917, at the age of 21, he left behind a wife and a daughter. In the early morning of September 28, 1918, what was to be the last day of his life, Corporal Freddy Stowers served as the squad leader of Company C as they prepared to take Hill 188 in the Champagne-Marne sector. Major Joseph Pate, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 371st, wrote later about the action that day.
This was about 5:45 o'clock, and the fog was quite dense in the valleys. The company commanders were assembled in a nearby dugout, where I explained the situation with the aid of a battle map and issued verbal attack orders.
A German officer had just surrendered with 35 of his men, saying that they had been left behind to defend the hill, but were unwilling to throw their lives away for a lost cause.
This information, coupled with the opinion expressed by the French battalion commander, led me to believe that we had a very easy task before us, and I so informed my company commanders. The assault platoons of C Company moved out as skirmishers. At a point about 300 yards in front of the trench of Hill 188, the left platoon of C Company was forced to cut its way through 2 very heavy systems of wire, in the face of some fire from defenders from within the trench.
Barbed wire had become a critical part of the defensive warfare of World War I, and infantry always carried wire cutters with them. As some men of Stowers C Company worked on the wire, other members of the company returned fire, providing cover for the wire cutters.
Within a few minutes, the Germans ceased firing and began climbing up on the parapet of the trench, holding up their arms as if wishing to surrender. Our platoon commanders ordered their men to cease firing as the Boches were surrendering. Our men promptly ceased firing, and the battalion again started forward. And when within 100 meters of the trench, someone within blew a whistle, and the Germans who had been standing up on the parapet immediately jumped back into their trenches, and C Company was greeted with interlocking bands of machine gun fire and short-range mortar fire. The leading platoons of C Company were almost annihilated, including both platoon commanders. This was a genuine surprise to all of us, and the battalion was flat on its face without waiting for orders.
Corporal Stowers' Medal of Honor citation describes what happened next. With extraordinary heroism and complete disregard of personal danger under devastating fire, he crawled forward, leading his squad toward an enemy machine gun nest, which was causing heavy casualties to his company. After fierce fighting, the machine gun position was destroyed and the enemy soldiers were killed. Displaying great courage and intrepidity, Corporal Stowers continued to press the attack against a determined enemy. While crawling forward and urging his men to continue the attack on a second trench line, he was gravely wounded by machine gun fire. Although Corporal Stowers was mortally wounded, he pressed forward, urging on the members of his squad until he died. Inspired by the heroism and display of bravery of Corporal Stowers, his company continued the attack against incredible odds, contributing to the capture of Hill 188 and causing heavy enemy casualties. Corporal Stowers' conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and supreme devotion to his men were well above and beyond the call of duty, following the finest traditions of military service and reflecting the utmost credit on him and the United States Army. Freddy Stowers is buried at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery and Memorial, not far from where he died. Corporal Stowers' commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor soon after this action. For whatever reason, this recommendation was not processed. Some believe that this was due to Stowers serving in an all-black regiment. However, 3 other black soldiers were also recommended for the Medal of Honor. None of these men received that award, but they did receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Whether their valorous actions were given less merit because of their race is an open question, but since they did receive a prestigious honor, unlike Freddy Stowers, it is at least plausible that the paperwork for Stowers' recommendation was misplaced. Decades would pass, and Stowers' bravery faded from memory. Then, in 1988, 70 years after the Argonne Offensive, the Secretary of the Army ordered an investigation into the possibility that any African American soldiers had been denied a Medal of Honor due to their race. During the course of this investigation, the original recommendation for Corporal Stowers was found, and after a careful study of the actions taken on September 28, 1918, the Army Decorations Board approved the recommendation. And on April 24, 1991, President George H.W. Bush presented Freddy Stowers' Medal of Honor to his surviving sisters in a White House ceremony. 10 days after the actions and the death of Corporal Stowers, another man would display gallantry and valor that would result in a Medal of Honor. His actions also took place during the Argonne Offensive, and like Stowers, this man was a corporal. The world remembers him better, however, by his later rank, Sergeant York. Alvin York was a deeply religious man out of Pall Mall, Tennessee. He registered for the Selective Service and responded when called, but he was conflicted about fighting in the war.
I was worried clean through. I didn't want to go and kill. I believed in my Bible.
Conversations with his commanding officer, also a devout Christian, convinced York that God intended for him to fight and would protect him in the war. And he would have particular need of protection on October 8, 1918. York kept a diary throughout the war and described the events of that day.
This was our first offensive battle in the Argonne. We started over the top at 6:10 a.m. and the Germans was putting their machine guns to work all over the hill in front of us and on our left and right. So I was in support and I could see my pals getting picked off until it almost looked like there was none left. We got through the shells and the gas and occupied Hill 223, which was to be our jumping off place for the advance on the railroad. When the 0 hour came, we went over the top and started our advance. We had to charge across a valley several hundred yards wide and rush the machine gun emplacements on the ridge on the far side. And there were machine guns on the ridges on our flanks too. So you see, we were getting it from the front and both flanks. Well, the first and second waves got about halfway across the valley and then were held up by machine gun fire from the three sides. It was awful. Our losses were very heavy. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home. And to make matters worse, something had happened to our artillery and we had no barrage. So we decided to try and get them by a surprise attack in the rear.
York and 16 others from his battalion were working their way behind the German lines to try to take out the machine guns that were defending the line. They were able to overrun one German unit, capturing a large group of German soldiers. But while they were contending with the prisoners, they were sprayed by machine gun fire from a ridge beyond them. 9 men went down, 6 dead. Corporal York was the highest-ranking man left. York left his men to guard the prisoners and worked his way toward the German machine gun nest alone.
Those machine guns was spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me something awful. And the Germans were yelling orders. You never heard such a racket in all your life. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the brush. As soon as the machine guns opened up fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. Every time I see the German, I just teched him off. At first I was shooting from a prone position, just like we often shoot at the targets in the shooting matches in the mountains of Tennessee. And it was just about the same distance, but the targets here were bigger. In the middle of the fight, a German officer and 5 men done jumped out of a trench and charged me with affixed bayonets. They had about 25 yards to come, and they were coming right smart. I only had about half a clip left in my rifle, but I had my pistol ready. I teched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, and so on. That's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home. You see, we don't want the front ones to know that we're getting the back ones, and then they keep on coming till we get them all. Of course, I hadn't time to think of that. I guess I just naturally did it. I know, too, that if the front ones wavered, or if I stopped them, the rear ones would done drop and pump a volley into me and get me. Then I returned to the rifle and kept right on after those machine guns. I hollered to them to come down and give up. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. I'd take a couple of them off and holler again.
Faced with his growing losses, the German lieutenant commanding the unit called out in English to York, offering their surrender. York accepted. As a memorial, in the French village of Château-Chéry, states, armed with a rifle and pistol, he silenced a German battalion of 35 machine guns, killed 25 enemy soldiers, and captured 132. Unlike Freddy Stowers, Alvin York had the good fortune to survive his Medal of Honor action. He was quickly promoted to sergeant and given the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. Months later, the commanding general of the American forces, General Pershing, presented him with the Medal of Honor. Sergeant York, as he is remembered today, survived the war and returned home to great acclaim. His story was published in the Saturday Evening Post, which had over 2 million readers. He visited Congress, where he received a standing ovation from the House of Representatives. Throughout his life, York was offered many chances to profit from his fame. He refused multiple offers to purchase movie rights to his story or to be a product spokesman. As a result, he frequently had problems with debt, but he lent his name to several charitable causes and civic projects. He did finally agree to sell rights to his story, and used the funds to finance a Bible school. The movie, Sergeant York, starred Gary Cooper and was nominated for 11 Oscars, winning 2. In 1921, Alvin York was one of the pallbearers at the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Joining him was another recipient of the Medal of Honor, Sam Woodfill. Woodfill was one of the rare soldiers who had been with the Army long before the start of World War I. Having enlisted in 1901, Woodfill was 35 when, in April 1918, he was sent to war. Woodfill and his regiment joined in the Argonne Offensive, which he described as 46 days of rain and mud and death and general hell such as no American army had ever faced. In the early morning fog of October 12, 1918, Woodfill led his company in a long line toward the village of Cunel. As they crossed a field, the fog lifted and 3 machine gun nests let loose. While his men found cover, Woodfill took his rifle and began to stalk the machine gunners. An expert marksman who'd been hunting since the age of 10, Woodfill put his extraordinary talent to work, clearing out machine gun nests. He found a spot where he could take cover while keeping the 3 machine gun nests in sight. One was set up in a church tower, 200 to 300 yards away. Another fired from an abandoned stable to the right, and the third was straight ahead under the cover of forest. He focused on the church tower first. He couldn't see the gunner, but he aimed behind the flash of the machine gun. He fired, and the machine gun was silenced. His next target was the abandoned stable. Again, the gunner was hidden, but again, Woodfill shot where the gunner should be, and the machine gun went quiet. To reach the nest in the forest, he had to stalk around to the side, taking cover in holes created by shelling. One hole concealed a pocket of mustard gas, which he inhaled before realizing it. He avoided a fatal dose, but now his eyes were stinging and his vision blurry. Still, he moved on, creeping quietly until he was hidden from view, but in a spot where he could spy the face of the gunner in the third nest. Woodfill fired, and the man went down. Another took his place, and he fired again. 2 more took up the machine gun, each killed by a single shot from Woodfill. Finally, the remaining 2 Germans fled. His men looked on with awe. Woodfill signaled them to move up. He then returned to the hunt. Each nest he cleared improved the odds of his men surviving the day. He found 2 more machine gun nests past Cunel, and he took the 5-man crew operating each with 5 well-placed shots. He was forced to dive into a trench when another nest opened up on him, and he found himself face to face with 2 German soldiers. Woodfill shot the first with his pistol, but when he turned to fire on the second, his gun jammed. As the German dove for a rifle, Woodfill grabbed a pickaxe from where it lay in the trench and killed the second German before he could fire. A bullet whizzing past his ear alerted him that the first German was not yet dead. He spun and finished the man off with the pickaxe. Woodfill had taken out 5 machine gun nests and the 2 Germans in the trench without taking an injury. But the exposure to the mustard gas took him out of fighting. He and his men rejoined the rest of the American forces, but he was quickly moved to a hospital. By the time he had recovered, the war was over. In February 1919, General Pershing, the commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, presented First Lieutenant Woodfill with the Medal of Honor. 2 years later, General Pershing remarked that Sam Woodfill was the greatest single hero in the American forces. But America had no shortage of heroes in World War I, such as Marine Corporal John Pruitt. Like Freddy Stowers, Pruitt was also part of an American unit temporarily attached to the French Fourth Army. Corporal Pruitt's unit was on loan to the French to assist them in punching through the German defenses in the Champagne. On October 3rd, Corporal Pruitt and his fellow Marines attacked the Blanc-Mont Ridge, called the keystone of the arch of the main German position. In the course of the battle, Corporal Pruitt single-handedly attacked 2 machine guns, capturing them and killing 2 of the enemy. He then captured 40 prisoners in a dugout nearby. But though he survived these actions, which earned him his Medal of Honor, he was killed soon afterward by shell fire. Pruitt was one of only 19 people who received 2 Medals of Honor, one from the Army and one from the Marine Corps, both for the same action. After World War I, the rules would change so that only 1 Medal of Honor could be awarded for a single action. Despite the tightening of the criteria for the award, 119 men would receive the Medal of Honor for actions in World War I. Men like Major Charles Whittlesey, the leader of the Lost Battalion. He and his men had been cut off from the remainder of their division. For 5 days, they faced superior numbers in the enemy, without rations or other supplies. On the 4th day, he was offered a chance to surrender, but that, as his citation says, he treated with contempt. And bosun's mate 2nd Class John Siegel of the Navy. Siegel repeatedly boarded a burning schooner, rescuing crew members at the risk of his own life. And 1st Lieutenant Eddie Rickenbacker of the Army Air Corps, the famous flying ace who had 26 aerial combat victories. And more than 100 other brave men whose actions under fire went above and beyond the call of duty. The American soldiers of World War I committed acts of heroism that are too numerous to describe in detail here. No doubt many of their tales were never told because no witnesses survived to tell them. But the stories that remain, telling of 119 men of extraordinary valor, should inspire us all.